Hey friends, welcome back. We're here for episode 3 in my photo series where I actually teach you stuff about photography, all the boring jargon that you're probably going to fast forward through anyway. So yeah! Be prepared for another boring talk. Today, we're going to go over aperture and AV mode on your camera. In our previous 2 episodes, I've went over shutter speed and TV mode and how to use that in your camera. And in the episode before that, we talked about ISO and program mode, P mode. So if you have not watched those yet, I recommend you watch those 2 videos. I'll put a link up here in the corner for you to click on so you can check out that series. I'd watch those episodes before you tune to this one. If you already understand ISO, already understand shutter speed, you don't know what aperture is? Well, maybe this is a video you want to check out. So, aperture is not determined by your camera. So you control the aperture through your camera, but aperture values are set by your lens. So this lens I'm holding, this is a 17 to 40 millimeter f4 lens. Now what that means is the lowest aperture, the widest aperture that this lens can obtain is f4. But Eric, I don't have a fancy camera like that. I've got one of these. Point and shoot camera. So can I control aperture on this, or do I need a DSLR? Well, you'll notice on the lens of this little camera, and a lot of them will say it, if we can focus the camera, not me, but down here it's got a little value. Now my lens is an 8.8 to 36.8 millimeter lens. The aperture values are 1.8, 2.8. With most zoom lenses, your aperture changes based on how far you zoom. If I'm zoomed all the way in on this camera, the minimum aperture I can have is f2.8. At its widest angle, the minimum aperture is f1.8. Now, the lower the number, the bigger the hole the camera lets, the bigger the hole is to let light in the camera. So the more light gets in. The lower the number, the more light gets in, the brighter your image is. Now, a lot of phones don't let you adjust the settings. Some of your more expensive phones will allow you to change the aperture, and the widest aperture on a lot of these cell phones now is f1.8, which is pretty incredible. So now I have a zoom lens here. Earlier I said with zoom lenses it changes based on the zoom factor. This is an expensive L series lens. One of the benefits of this lens is it's got a consistent aperture throughout its focal range. So even when I zoom all the way into 40 millimeters, my minimum aperture is going to be f40. If I was shooting on another lens, so when I shop for a lens, I look for a lens with a wide aperture, and that's based on my style. Now I know I haven't shown you images yet, but this is kind of the process to teach you aperture a little bit, because it's different from your other camera settings, and it is all based on your lenses and why lenses get so expensive. Normally lenses with wider apertures are more expensive, especially if it's consistent throughout the focal range of the lens. So you might see a 70 to 200 lens that is $1,000, and then you think it's the same 70 to 200 lens, but the other one is $2,000. The difference being the aperture ranges on the two lenses very different, and it totally changes the quality of your images. So aperture is probably the most important camera setting when it comes to image quality and what we call depth of field, and I'll go into that as we kind of go through these images that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to show you images on the lens that we're filming on right now, my 50mm f1.4 lens. So I did say that lenses with a wider aperture are usually more expensive. The exception comes in terms of the 50mm lens, which is probably the lens that I would recommend everybody start out with, no matter what DSLR you get. Is probably a 50mm 1.8. Nifty 50, it's called a lot. It is probably one of the cheapest lenses to buy into, usually around $100. Its minimum aperture or widest aperture is f1.8, and with that you can do some really incredible things to image quality. I'm using the f1.4 version, a little more expensive than the Nifty 50 because aperture opens up a little wider. Honestly, I sold my Nifty 50 f1.8. I think I prefer that lens more than the 1.4, just because when you're really dealing with really wide open apertures like this, it is harder to grab focus. You'll notice just even looking at my face, the drop off in focus. So yeah, now that we're 10 minutes in, let's take a look at some of the images and kind of show you what aperture does. So for this first series of images, I'm going to be showing you on my 50mm lens. I'm going to change that on the second half when we go into using this lens right here in my 17 to 40mm. So we are shooting in AV mode here. Now AV mode allows you to control your aperture, and just like shutter speed TV mode, I set the ISO to automatic for these images to allow it to show you to pick the best settings for the camera. Now when shooting concerts, I primarily shoot in Aperture Priority, and I leave my aperture as wide as it can be. When I take a portrait, pretty much my style of photography is based around wide open aperture. Not only does wide open aperture allow lots of light to come into the camera, but it also controls your depth of field, or how much of the image is in focus, the bokeh, what makes your image pretty. So all of this background blur that's out of focus is because my aperture is wide open. Now I'll just show you, if we take a look at this image shot on my f4 lens, because the minimum aperture on this lens is f4, everything's a lot sharper. That background blur that's in this image is not there. That's kind of the key to why my images are so I play off bokeh a lot, I guess, in my style. Is I want to get my subject as sharp as possible, and then I want this really nice blurry background, so the subject of my image is kind of the center of attention. And that's what aperture does, and why I put out more money for an expensive lens that can shoot at a wider aperture, so I can get my beautiful bokeh. And you'll see it's not going to change so much with the 50mm until we really get into some of the higher apertures. But yeah, because of the distance that I'm standing and the aperture, that's how I'm attaining this blurry background. So what happens when we move it up? Okay, here F2. You'll notice, just looking around the sides of my face, the sides of my face get sharper. There's not as much of a drop off in detail. Just changing the aperture one stop of light. I'm gonna go up again, f2.8. Still nice blurry background. And so the camera's deciding we're at an ISO rating of 1600, which is gonna give us a little bit of a film grain look, but not a lot of bad noise. We're still at a very slow shutter speed though, and that's because my room isn't really brightly lit. It's got one ceiling fan light, and I've got my light that I use for video very, very dimly lit here. So that's how I'm getting a good proper exposure, but the shutter speed is very slow. So if I were shooting handheld, this image probably wouldn't work. It'd be very blurry. We kind of talked about that last episode, going over shutter speed. Okay, here we are at f4. So you'll notice, we'll go look at these two images. Can I compare? Yeah. So the 50mm at f4, I still have a lot more blur than I do on my 17 to 40mm. And the reason being is my focal distance. I'm stuck at 50mm here, so I'm propped a little more on the sensor than I am here at 40mm. So the image is going to be a little bit sharper at the same aperture value based on how close I am to the subject. So if you're using a zoom lens and you want this kind of bokeh effect, you gotta zoom all the way in on the lens and really kind of frame your subject up, and you'll start to get this bokeh effect with shallower apertures. Okay, gonna go up, and so now the bokeh from here is going to be based on my focal distance, just like the last image. So, but we're going to really see more detail in my face. Starting to get some digital noise, the higher ISO, but we are still maintaining that properly exposed image. Here's f8. It's going to really start to crank the ISO because the shallower the aperture, the less light that gets in the camera. The aperture is, there's blades inside your lens that make, I can't really adjust the aperture on this lens. But you'll see as you take an image, if you're looking in to the camera as you take a self-portrait, you'll see blades that kind of turn and close and make a little hole. And how wide that hole is or how narrow that hole is your aperture value. It's the physical blades. And based on your lens might have more aperture blades with a more expensive lens than a cheaper lens. And it'll totally adjust how your depth of field is based on how many blades you have and how wide or narrow that hole is that it's opening. So we continue on f11. The hole's even tinier, so we really got to crank ISO, and we're really dropping shutter speed to maintain an image that's in focus, or maintain a properly exposed image. Sorry, get focus, properly exposed, where you can see details and the highlights and shadows of my image. F16, same thing, but we're really seeing detail come into the background of my image now. Whereas if we go back, look at the loss of detail in my background compared to when we step the aperture up. We are at f22. You can kind of see what's going on in my room, in my background. One of the first images I took learning photography. Yeah. Taken on the Nifty 50, by the way. But if we go all the way back, you can't even tell that's there. We compare two images. This is a difference in aperture values. Yeah. Okay. So now, with this image, just like our ISO lesson, we're going to come back to these are the settings that I would use to take a self-portrait in manual mode. So we're switching away from AV mode here to kind of show you the lightness and darkness, how it's going to change drastically your image, the light that's let in when opening and closing your aperture at different values. So at f1.4, I've got lots of light coming in. I want a sharp image, sharp details in my eyes. So I shot at a shutter speed of 1/125. Also used a tripod, remote shutter, no real movement. I can kind of capture a lot of detail in my face. And because my room is very poorly lit, I have to crank the ISO to 1250. Gives me a little bit of digital noise, but nothing that's going to ruin the details in my photos. This is something that I would go out and deliver to a client happily using these settings. Now, nope, we want this. So now we're going to start cranking up the aperture. We're going to leave our shutter speed and ISO alone and show you what happens when we change the aperture on each photo. So here's the next stop. You'll already see that it's a much darker image. So in terms of light value, how wide that hole is to let light in on your sensor makes a big difference. That's one full stop of light. Let's go to the next stop. And we're really starting to lose detail already. F4. Okay. So, here's the problem. My 17 to 40 millimeter lens, it starts at f4. So if I want a nice pretty portrait with this lens, I can't just go on the internet and look up settings. Oh, my shutter speed should be at 125, my ISO should be at 1250. It's not going to work like that. So we have to adjust our shutter speed and our ISO to get a properly exposed image at f4. But let's continue on down the light spectrum and keep going up. What's the next stop going to do? f5.6. Starting to get pretty dark. What's going to happen if we crank it even higher? One more. f11. We're almost completely black. f16. You can barely see anything. There's almost no light in the image. And then finally f22. It's not going to capture anything. So we'll go through a quick rapid fire run through. First, showing you aperture and how it affects your depth of field, and your background is going to come more in focus, but you have to adjust your other settings to get that background either out of focus or in focus. Now, in terms of light, this is what aperture does when you increase the aperture to a higher value. Now, your lens determines what aperture values you are, what aperture values you have. More than likely, the cap on most cameras is f22. Might be different based on your point and shoot camera, your phone, on what aperture values it can obtain. as it's all based on the lens. So why would I ever shoot at f/22? Why would I ever take an image at this aperture value? Well, we'll go over that when I show you long exposures and how I get creative with bulb mode. For my style, I normally set my aperture to f1.4, leave it alone, don't touch it, and use shutter speed and ISO to obtain my proper exposure because I want the beautiful bokeh in the background. Now, when I do my light painting portraits, I crank my aperture up to about f/22 because I'm letting so much light in the camera that if I were to keep the aperture wide open, that I would overexpose my image. We kind of saw that in the last episode with long shutters. We definitely saw it in the ISO episode. So yeah, you can really play around with how much light is in your camera by combining all the different settings. But if you're just shooting in AV mode, you'll probably want to stay away from high aperture values and shoot in lower aperture values. Now, I normally shoot concerts in AV mode, and I do that to set my aperture at a very wide value like this, and I'll normally crank my ISO pretty high, because if I don't crank the ISO high with my wide aperture, then the camera's going to pick a shutter speed for me that is very slow, and I'm going to run into a lot of motion blur, which doesn't really work when shooting a musical performer who's moving around the stage a lot. There are also other things I do, like shooting AI servo mode, changing how my focus works, but we can save that for another video. I wouldn't recommend shooting in AV mode if you're doing concerts for the first time. I think you really need to understand focus and shutter speed. You might want to try shooting in TV mode and really playing around with high ISO values to get better images, but I'm a sucker for bokeh, and I try to get that even in the images of musicians that I take. So me being stubborn I shoot in AV mode to keep a wide aperture so I can get all this nice bokeh in the background. So now what happens when we change lenses? So we've got our f/22 image here. Let's switch lenses and show you what a zoom lens does. Here is my 17 to 40 millimeter. I wasn't fully wide at this point, but I wanted to get, again, I think we're in manual mode here. Proper exposure. So in order to get an image in my low lit room, I had to really crank my ISO. And you'll see that the noise generated is pretty bad, but this image is still usable. It's something that can be cleaned up using software like Lightroom to adjust the noise in the image. You can denoise your image, make it look a little better. And here we go, zoomed in at f4. Now I'm going to f8 to kind of show you the darkness. I'm not sure what I'm showing here. I guess I'm trying to show you how to get a properly exposed image using a if we look at my camera settings, I was on manual, so I was trying to show how to get a properly exposed image using settings I would use. Still, I think my ISO is a little too high. I don't really like shooting. I think, oh, the lights on here, lights on here. I didn't take an image with the lights off using this image, or using this lens. So yeah, that's at f8, f6.3. You'll notice how my ISO and shutter speed changes. Yeah. So yeah, that kind of shows the difference between Aperture. It is probably the most difficult setting to grasp, but once, I think I said that about shutter speed too. Yeah. There's a lot more in terms of Aperture. But if you want to take nice portraits, I'd go as wide open as you can and stay there. Let shutter speed decide your sharpness, and then ISO determine how bright or dark your image is. If you're still confused, play around with AV mode to figure out Aperture, play around with TV mode to figure out shutter speed, play around in program mode to figure out ISO. So yeah, this is it for my boring photography jargon lesson to teach you Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Hopefully this was useful. Hopefully you learned something. Maybe you didn't. Maybe this is all common knowledge to you. But yeah, maybe even taking images with your cell phone, switching it to the pro mode, adjusting the settings, you might have some ideas on how to change the way you take a selfie. Or you have a point shoot and you're a vlogger, and this will help you understand the settings to get better video or better images when you go out to the zoo or you're out with your family. You've got little point and shoot. Oh, I'm out at the zoo. It's a bright, sunny day. I'm going to go to TV mode and crank the shutter speed so I can get really sharp images of the animals. Hopefully it's useful. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the series. Next up, I think I'll teach you guys bulb mode, how to get a little creative shooting with long exposures to do some really cool, maybe light painting effects, and how to get ghostly images, because I did promise that. I promised I would make a video on that, and I will. So maybe we'll do that next. Anyways, yeah. Comment down below. Let's talk photography stuff. I'll respond. Anybody leaves a comment, I'll respond. So, anyone, thanks for checking out the video. See you guys later. Bye bye.